Let's start with The Surge 2. I feel like it doesn't get enough credit, but I had such a good time with it. If you're into that whole Souls-like experience, but with a sci-fi twist, this game is exactly what you need. It takes that punishing, tactical combat formula and throws it into this futuristic, dystopian world, which is a super cool setting for this kind of gameplay. The thing that really hooked me was the combat. It's brutal, but in the best way. You're not just hacking and slashing mindlessly. You actually have to target specific limbs, which adds a whole new layer of strategy. I loved figuring out which part of an enemy I wanted to focus on. Do I go for the unarmored areas for an easy kill? Or do I try to chop off a limb to get some sweet gear? Every fight felt like a puzzle, and I never got tired of that. Jericho City has this gritty industrial feel to it. The world building is solid. There's this mix of high-tech and complete chaos, and as you explore, you find out more about what went wrong in this messed-up future. The city itself is pretty open, with tons of shortcuts and hidden paths, which made exploring feel rewarding. Plus, the verticality of the levels was cool. You're not just walking through corridors. You're jumping, climbing, and finding secret areas that connect back in smart ways. It had that same feeling as Dark Souls, in how the world loops back on itself. The story is pretty interesting too. You're kind of dropped into this mess without much context, and as you play, you slowly piece together what happened in Jericho City. Next we have Ghost Recon Wildlands. It's one of those games that kind of slipped under the radar for a lot of people, but honestly, it's so much fun once you get into it. I mean, the sheer scale of the open world is wild. Bolivia is your playground, and you can literally go anywhere. I remember the first time I jumped in a helicopter and just flew over this huge mountain range, seeing the sprawling landscape below. It's kind of breathtaking, even for an older game. The thing that really stands out, though, is how flexible the gameplay is. You've got this whole squad with you, and you can approach missions in so many different ways. If you're feeling tactical, you can scout out an area with your drone, mark enemies, and silently pick them off one by one. Or you can just go in guns blazing and let the chaos unfold. And I love that both options work. There's no one way to play it. And man, playing co-op with friends, that's where it gets really fun. There's nothing quite like coordinating an attack with your buddies, where everyone's got their role. One person's sniping, another's on the ground sneaking in, and then you're calling in air support. It just makes you feel like a real squad. Of course, it doesn't always go according to plan, and when everything falls apart, it turns into this hilarious mess of trying to escape or salvage the mission. But that's part of the charm, right? I also appreciate how the game doesn't take itself too seriously. Sure, it's got this gritty cartel storyline, but the characters crack jokes, and there are these moments of levity that break up the intensity. The only downside? I guess some missions can get a bit repetitive if you're playing solo for too long. Next we have Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Right off the bat, you can tell that The Lost Legacy is something special. It has all the cinematic action we expect from Uncharted, but this time, it's not Nathan Drake who's running the show. Instead, we've got Chloe, who's smart, witty, and honestly, she brings her own unique charm to the game. One thing that makes The Lost Legacy really stand out is its pacing. It's a shorter game compared to other Uncharted titles, but I think that actually works in its favor. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Instead, it packs all the best parts of Uncharted, the thrill, the exploration, the witty dialogue, into a streamlined, punchy experience that just flows. Every chapter feels meaningful, and there's no filler. You're either uncovering secrets, taking in stunning views, or engaged in some seriously intense action sequences. The combat feels great, and The Lost Legacy knows how to ramp up the tension. You'll be sneaking through enemy camps, dodging explosions, and getting into some pretty epic shootouts. Chloe and Nadine each have their own combat styles, which makes for some fun team dynamics. Nadine's more of a punch first, ask questions later type, while Chloe is a bit more of a thinker. Seeing them work together, especially in tight situations, is super satisfying. You can tell that Naughty Dog put a lot of effort into building their relationship. It's not all friendship and warm fuzzies. These two come from different backgrounds, and they've got a history that's, well, complicated. Next we have Hellblade 2. The first Hellblade was all about that raw, emotional journey and its deep dive into mental health. So when the sequel came out, a lot of people were expecting the same kind of intimate experience. And while it definitely delivers on atmosphere and emotion, not everyone's on board with some of the changes. One of the big things people are talking about is the shift towards more combat. In the first game, the fighting was kind of secondary to the story. It was there, but it wasn't the main focus, With Hellblade 2, they've definitely ramped up the action, and some fans aren't too happy about that. They wanted more of those quiet, introspective moments that made the first game stand out. But honestly, I think the combat adds a new layer of intensity. Sure, it's more frequent, but it's still tied to Senua's emotional journey, and it makes sense within the context of the story. Another thing that stirred up some controversy is whether the game leans too heavily into its cinematic elements. There's a lot of visual spectacle in Hellblade 2. The graphics are insane, and the world building is next level, but some players feel like it's trying to be more of a movie than a game, which has rubbed a few people the wrong way. I get that, but at the same time, this is what Hellblade is all about, immersing you in this visceral, haunting world. What I love, though, is how Hellblade 2 stays true to its roots. Despite all these changes, it still tackles heavy themes like trauma and mental illness, and it does it with a lot of care and respect. That alone makes it stand out in today's gaming landscape. And even with more combat, it doesn't lose that emotional depth. Next, we have Atomic Heart. From the moment you jump into this weird, retro-futuristic Soviet world, you can tell you're in for something totally different. The whole vibe of the game is what grabbed me first. It's like if BioShock and Half-Life had this crazy alternate reality baby. The setting just pulls you in right away. Everything's all shiny and utopian on the surface, but you can feel this eerie tension creeping in. Like something's definitely not right here. The aesthetics? Absolutely stunning. It's got this whole 1950s retro sci-fi look, but it's set in this alternate version of the USSR where technology advanced in these weird, unsettling ways. Robots everywhere. And they're not your friendly, helpful kind either. As you're exploring, you've got this constant sense of, okay, when's the next crazy thing gonna try and kill me? It keeps you on edge, but in a fun way. Combat is intense, but super satisfying. You've got all these cool weapons, and then you mix in these crazy powers you can use with your left hand. It's like you're blasting enemies with a shotgun in one hand while using telekinesis or freezing them with your other hand. The mix of gunplay and abilities just feels so smooth and fluid. And let me tell you, when you finally master the combo system, you feel like a total badass. The enemies are really something too. You've got these creepy humanoid robots with weird, unsettling movements, and then there are the more bizarre, out there designs that look like something out of a fever dream. Every encounter feels different because the enemies keep you on your toes. Next we have Wolfenstein: The New Order. It's an absolute blast of a game, and I mean that literally. It's one of those titles that grabs you from the very start with its intense action, gripping story, and just straight-up brutal combat. It's a reimagining of a classic series, but it manages to feel both modern and respectful to its roots. The game is set in an alternate history where the Nazis won World War II, and it's your job as BJ Blazkowicz to bring them down. It's got this perfect balance of being both over the top and really emotionally engaging. The gameplay, though, that's where Wolfenstein really shines. It's this perfect mix of old-school shooter mechanics with some modern twists. You've got dual-wielding guns, fast movement, and the ability to choose between stealth or going full Rambo in most situations. What's awesome is that the game gives you a ton of freedom in how you approach combat. You can sneak around, taking enemies out silently, or just run in, guns blazing, and leave a trail of destruction. Personally, I love switching between the two, depending on the situation. The pacing of the game is fantastic as well. You're constantly moving between different environments and situations. 1 minute, you're in a Nazi prison, trying to escape, and the next, you're on a mission to infiltrate a moon base. Yes, a moon base. The game really goes all out with its setting, and it's not afraid to get a little weird with the sci-fi elements. There's a ton of variety in the level design, and you never really know what the game's going to throw at you next. Whether you're in it for the action or the story, it delivers on both fronts. Next we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. This game took one of the most iconic RPGs of all time and flipped it in the best way possible. It was a love letter to fans of the original, while also introducing a whole new generation to the world of Final Fantasy VII. Honestly, it not winning Game of the Year still feels like a bit of a robbery. First off, the remake was more than just a visual upgrade. Yes, the graphics were jaw-dropping. Midgar looked absolutely incredible, from the towering structures of Shinra to the gritty streets of the slums. But it was the way they expanded the story that really stood out. Characters like Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse, who were barely more than side characters in the original, suddenly had fleshed-out backstories and personalities. It made you care about them in a way you just couldn't before, which made certain story moments hit even harder. The combat was another huge change. Gone were the strict turn-based mechanics, replaced with this hybrid system that mixed action and strategy. You could hack and slash through enemies in real time, but still slow things down to issue commands, use spells, or unleash limit breaks. It was the perfect blend of old and new, catering to both fans of traditional JRPGs and those who preferred more modern action RPG mechanics. Another reason it might have missed out on Game of the Year is that 2020 was a crazy year for games. The Last of Us Part 2 took home the big prize, and while that game had its own controversies, it was a narrative and technical powerhouse that dominated most of the awards that year. Next we have Dying Light 2, another game that stumbled out of the gate, but is actually pretty awesome when you take a closer look. So, when Dying Light 2 was first announced, people were hyped. The original Dying Light was a sleeper hit, with its intense parkour system and brutal combat, so expectations were sky high for the sequel. But then, delays happened. Lots of them. And with every delay, the excitement started turning into skepticism. When it finally launched in 2022, some people felt like it didn't quite live up to the years of anticipation, and there was plenty of chatter about bugs and performance issues, which, to be fair, did hurt its reputation right out of the gate. But here's the thing. Once you actually dive into Dying Light 2, you realize there's a ton to love about this game. First off, the parkour system is still one of the best in gaming. Running, jumping, and swinging through the city of Villador feels fluid and rewarding. They took what worked in the original and just cranked it up a notch. You really feel like you're flying through this post-apocalyptic world, dodging zombies and hopping between rooftops. The combat? Absolutely brutal. Smacking zombies and bandits with improvised weapons, drop-kicking them off rooftops. It never gets old. Plus, the day-night cycle adds a whole other layer of tension. The zombies are slow and manageable during the day, but at night, man, they become terrifying. It's a heart-pounding experience when you're scrambling to find shelter as the sun goes down and the city gets overrun. Next we have Resident Evil 3 Remake. Definitely one of those games that's way better than people give it credit for. Seriously, if you haven't given it a shot or maybe dismissed it because it's shorter than other Resident Evil games, you're missing out. It's packed with intense moments, killer gameplay, and one of the most relentless enemies in the series. You've got Jill Valentine, who is such a badass, going through Raccoon City as it just falls apart. The whole city is basically on fire, zombies everywhere. And then you've got Nemesis. My God, Nemesis. That thing is relentless. Every time you hear him coming, that music kicks in, and it's like your heart rate just skyrockets. You think Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 was bad? This guy's next level. The thing I love about RE3 Remake is how fast-paced it is compared to some other Resident Evil games. It's way more action-heavy, and Jill feels like she's always moving, always surviving on the edge. The balance between survival and action is super well done. And there's still that classic Resident Evil inventory management, where you have to decide like, do I take more health or more ammo? I love that dilemma, because it makes every decision feel critical, especially when you've got Nemesis chasing you. And speaking of that, the combat in this game feels tight. It's satisfying when you nail those perfect dodges, and then counterattack. The dodge mechanic is probably one of the things that makes Jill feel so agile compared to Leon or Claire in RE2. You really feel like you're evolving with the gameplay as you get better at dodging zombies. Next we have Dragon Age Inquisition. I still remember diving into its world for the first time and just being blown away by the sheer scope of it. It's got everything you'd want from a fantasy game: epic battles, deep lore, complex characters, and of course, dragons. One of the coolest things about Inquisition is how it really gives you control over shaping the story. You play as the Inquisitor, this figure that rises up in the midst of chaos to bring peace to the world. But the choices you make? They have huge consequences. Every decision feels like it matters, whether it's deciding who to ally with or how to handle conflicts within your own party. It's classic BioWare, but on an even bigger scale. Combat is another thing that stands out. It's got that tactical depth where you can pause the action and plan out your moves, but if you want a more hands-on approach, you can just dive right in with real-time combat. It's a good mix, and it keeps things fresh, whether you prefer strategy or action. Plus, the variety of classes and abilities you can choose from is just awesome. You can be a rogue sneaking around with dual daggers or a mage casting massive spells. It really lets you tailor the combat to your playstyle. And let's not forget the story. The stakes are high from the get-go, with this massive tear in the sky called the Breach, spewing demons into the world. You're tasked with leading the Inquisition to close it, but there's so much more going on politically and socially. The romance options are another fan favorite, of course. BioWare really knows how to craft compelling relationships, and Inquisition is no exception. Next we have Assassin's Creed Unity. I know it got some heat when it first came out, but these days it's actually kind of a hidden gem. Paris during the French Revolution is just incredible. The city feels so alive with all the chaos of that time period. People rioting in the streets, vendors yelling, revolutionaries everywhere. You really feel like you're in the middle of it all. What I love most about Unity is the detail in the city. The way they've recreated Notre Dame and all the landmarks is just breathtaking. I mean, it's Paris. Who wouldn't want to explore every nook and cranny? Arno, the main character, gives off that classic Assassin's Creed vibe, but he's a bit more relatable. He's got this personal revenge story going on, which feels pretty typical for AC, but with the revolution happening around him, it adds a lot more tension. And the whole romance thing with Elise, I thought it was a nice touch, gave the story more depth. And let's talk parkour. The parkour in Unity is easily the best in the series. It just feels so smooth. Running through the narrow streets, climbing up buildings, it's like you can feel every jump and movement. Escaping guards or just free running across rooftops never gets old. The customization is a major highlight too. You can kit Arno out with different outfits, weapons, and abilities. Whether you want to go full stealth or just dive into combat, it's totally up to you. The freedom to shape how you play is awesome. Oh, and the co-op missions. I had so much fun with those. Running heists with friends, trying to coordinate attacks. It's pure chaos in the best way. Nothing goes to plan, but it's hilarious when it doesn't. Next we have Mafia 2. This game hits differently. It's got this classic, almost cinematic feel to it, like you're stepping into an old mobster movie. From the moment it starts, you're drawn into this gritty 1940s and 50s world where the cars are big, the suits are sharp, and everything's just dripping with atmosphere. The setting of Empire Bay feels alive, like you can almost smell the exhaust from the cars and hear the hum of jazz coming out of a diner as you pass by. But what really gets me about Mafia 2 is the story. You're following Vito Scaletta, this guy who's just trying to make a life for himself after returning home from World War II. And you feel for the guy. He's not some untouchable, over-the-top hero. He's just a regular dude who gets sucked into this whole criminal underworld. And it's not even glamorous. Mafia 2 makes it pretty clear that this life comes with heavy consequences. The missions are top-notch too. 1 minute you're robbing a jewelry store. The next you're in this intense shootout, ducking behind cars and trading gunfire. It's got this old-school classic gangster vibe. One thing I love is how Mafia 2 doesn't overdo the open-world stuff. It's not like you're getting sidetracked with a million random activities. The game keeps its focus tight on the story, which I appreciate. It feels like every mission matters, and you're always pushing forward to see what happens next. Even though it's been years since it came out, Mafia 2 still holds up. If you're into mobster stories or just love a game that feels cinematic, Mafia 2 is definitely worth revisiting. Next we have Doom 4. This game brought back the old-school shooter in the best way possible, but still didn't take home the Game of the Year award. And I'm still scratching my head over that because Doom was an absolute beast when it dropped. It was like ID Software said, let's show everyone how a real first-person shooter is done. First of all, Doom nailed the pacing. It was fast, chaotic, and brutal. Everything you want in a Doom game. They took that classic run-and-gun formula and cranked it up to 11. You're constantly moving, jumping, and tearing through demons like a one-man wrecking crew. The combat was a symphony of destruction, where stopping meant death. And let's not forget the glory kills, where you get rewarded for ripping apart demons up close in the most satisfying ways possible. The thing that made Doom stand out was how unapologetically old school it was. No cover mechanics, no reloading, just pure adrenaline-fueled action. It felt like a return to form for the genre. And in a sea of shooters that were leaning more toward tactical, slow-paced gameplay, Doom was like a wake-up call. It reminded everyone why the original Doom was such a phenomenon back in the day. Why it didn't win Game of the Year. One reason could be that it released in a pretty stacked year. 2016 had Overwatch taking a lot of the spotlight, and multiplayer shooters were all the rage. Doom, on the other hand, was a more solo-focused experience. Sure, it had a multiplayer mode, but that's not what people played it for. It was all about that single-player campaign. Next we have Days Gone. I'll admit, when I first heard about it, I wasn't expecting too much, but once I started playing, I got hooked. It's one of those open-world games where you get so lost in the world that hours just fly by. And let's be real, who doesn't love a good post-apocalyptic story with zombies? Or I guess freakers in this case. The thing that stands out to me the most is the world itself. Oregon, but post-apocalyptic. It's both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. You're riding your bike through these gorgeous landscapes, like snow-capped mountains and dense forests, but you know danger is lurking around every corner. It's such a cool mix of peaceful and intense. I remember just cruising down the highway at sunset, only to get ambushed by a freaker horde or a pack of wolves out of nowhere. Speaking of the bike, Days Gone really makes it feel like your best friend. I know it sounds weird, but you're constantly upgrading it, maintaining it, and using it to get out of some really tight spots. Running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, with freakers closing in, is one of those moments where you're like, okay, this is serious. But when you've got your bike tuned up and ready to go, it's an absolute blast to just ride through the wilderness, wind in your hair, dodging obstacles and escaping enemies. And then there's Deacon. I didn't expect to get so attached to his story, but as the game went on, I really started to feel for the guy. The freaker hordes, though, insane. The first time you run into one, it's pure panic. I'm talking hundreds of freakers coming at you all at once, and you have to figure out how to take them down, or just run for your life. Next we have The Last of Us Part 2. Now, I know this game stirred up a lot of heated discussions when it dropped, but let's be real, some of the hate was totally overblown. First off, people were divided right from the start due to the story direction. Without getting into spoilers, it's safe to say that the game took some big narrative risks. Naughty Dog didn't just play it safe with this one. They were like, nah, we're going all in. And while some fans weren't ready for those changes, that's exactly what makes the game bold. It wasn't afraid to challenge your emotions and expectations, and not every game dares to do that. Also, let's not forget how incredible the gameplay and world building are. Whether or not you agree with the story choices, the game is undeniably polished. The combat is intense, the environments are stunning, and the small details make the world feel lived in. Those aspects of the game were universally praised. And for good reason. The AI is surprisingly smart too. Enemies react to your tactics, work together, and even call out to each other by name, which makes it feel way more personal when you're in the thick of it. It adds this extra layer of immersion that's hard to ignore. Ultimately, The Last of Us 2 was unfairly hated by some. But over time, people have started to recognize its strengths. It's one of those games where, once you let go of the preconceived ideas and just take it for what it is, you realize how well-crafted and powerful it is. I think a lot of the initial backlash came from the hype and expectations. People had this picture-perfect idea of what a sequel should be, but Naughty Dog went a different route. Next we have Sniper Elite 5. A game that didn't exactly get the warmest reception from everyone when it launched. Now, if you've played any of the previous Sniper Elite games, you know what you're getting into. Tactical, long-range shooting, and those signature X-ray kill cams that are both brutal and weirdly satisfying. But when Sniper Elite 5 dropped, some people weren't all that impressed, and it ended up getting a bit of hate. One of the main complaints people had was that it didn't feel all that different from Sniper Elite 4. Some players were expecting a bigger leap forward in terms of gameplay and mechanics, but instead, they got more of the same. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you love the formula, but for some, it felt like the game was playing it too safe. People wanted more innovation, and when they didn't get it, the criticism started rolling in. Another controversial aspect is the game's pacing. Sniper Elite 5 is all about slow, methodical gameplay. You're sneaking around, scouting enemies, lining up the perfect shot. It's a thinking person's shooter. But not everyone's down for that kind of experience. But here's the thing. Sniper Elite 5 still absolutely nails what makes the series fun. The maps are massive and give you so many ways to approach your objectives. Whether you want to go in guns blazing or take a more stealthy route, the game gives you that freedom. Also, let's not forget those kill cams. People can criticize the game all they want, but there's nothing quite like watching a perfectly placed shot rip through an enemy's organs in slow motion. Next we have Horizon Forbidden West. If you enjoyed Horizon Zero Dawn, or just love the idea of exploring a stunning post-apocalyptic world with robotic creatures, this game is everything. It takes what made the first game so special and cranks it up even further. First off, the world is absolutely breathtaking. We're talking lush forests, sweeping deserts, misty mountains, and mysterious ruins, all packed with color and life. Every time you step into a new area, it feels like you're on an epic journey, and you can just feel the love that went into designing this world. It's one of those games where you'll find yourself stopping just to admire the views. The combat is even more intense than before. You're still going up against these awesome robotic creatures, but this time there's a lot more variety in how you can approach each encounter. You can try different strategies, depending on the creature type, use traps, experiment with elemental effects, or even override certain machines to turn them into allies. It makes every fight feel unique, especially since the machines have such varied designs and behaviors. Oh, and the underwater sections? They're gorgeous, and actually add a whole new layer to the game. Now, diving into lakes and exploring submerged ruins is part of the adventure, and it's so well done. It makes the world feel even bigger and more dynamic, because you're not just stuck on land anymore. Horizon Forbidden West is a perfect mix of action, exploration, and storytelling. It's one of those games where you can spend hours just getting lost in side quests and exploring. Next we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. For some reason, it didn't get the love it deserved when it first came out. I mean, Lara Croft is a gaming icon, and the rebooted trilogy had been going strong, but when Shadow of the Tomb Raider dropped, kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people, but honestly, this game is way better than its reputation suggests. Well, a lot of it came down to timing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider launched during a crowded time, with some big AAA games releasing around the same period, so it got overshadowed. Plus, some critics said it didn't do enough to innovate from the previous two games. People expected something groundbreaking after Rise of the Tomb Raider, but instead, they got a game that felt more like an evolution than a revolution. But here's the thing, what's so bad about sticking to a formula that works? The story, for example, is actually pretty deep. And let's not forget the world building. Shadow of the Tomb Raider has some of the most beautiful environments in the entire series. From dense jungles to hidden tombs, the game is visually stunning. The tombs themselves are more complex and rewarding than before, with some really creative puzzles that feel satisfying to solve. If you love the exploration and puzzle-solving aspects of Tomb Raider, this game nails it. Combat also feels more refined. Sure, it's not the focus as much as it was in the earlier reboot games, but that actually works in the game's favor. Shadow of the Tomb Raider encourages stealth and strategy over pure action, which fits the tone of the game. Next we have Fallout 76. I know this game got quite a bit of heat when it first came out, but after all the updates and expansions, it's a totally different experience now. Trust me, Bethesda really put in the work here, and it shows. First off, if you're into Fallout for the whole post-apocalyptic vibe, Fallout 76 still nails that perfectly. You're out there exploring the ruins of West Virginia, which is way more beautiful than I expected in an end-of-the-world kind of way. The landscapes are huge and varied, with misty forests, eerie bogs, and even mountainous areas where you'll get a stunning view of the wasteland. Honestly, the setting is a character in itself. And yes, it's multiplayer, meaning you'll run into other players as you explore. But don't worry, it's not like some chaotic battle royale or anything. You can still choose to play mostly on your own, focus on your story quests, or even just wander around, soaking in the atmosphere. But having others around adds this cool element of unpredictability, like maybe you're all just hanging out around a campfire, or someone pops up to trade supplies. It makes the world feel more alive, which is pretty rare in the Fallout series. Speaking of camps, let's talk camp building, which might be one of my favorite parts of the game. You can set up your own little homestead anywhere in the wilderness, and then customize it however you want. I mean, some people have made full-on mansions out there, and I'm over here just trying to get my campfire going. It's like a mix of Fallout survival with Sims creativity. So yeah, if you wrote Fallout 76 off at launch, I'd say give it another shot. Next we have Mass Effect Andromeda. When this game launched, it got a ton of hate, and a lot of it had to do with the infamous facial animations. I mean, people were making memes about the character's weird robotic expressions within hours of release. It was hard not to laugh, but at the same time, it took away from what the game was trying to do. On top of that, there were bugs. A lot of bugs. Some people felt the world was a bit empty compared to the richness of the original trilogy, and that really disappointed hardcore fans of the series. You know, expectations were sky high coming off the original Mass Effect trilogy, which is beloved for its deep story, memorable characters, and complex choices. Andromeda had a tough act to follow, and when it didn't hit the same highs, fans let their disappointment show. But here's the thing. If you step back and give Andromeda a fair shot, there's actually a lot to like. It's got this huge open-world feel with new planets to explore and a brand new galaxy to discover. The combat is actually one of the highlights, really fluid and fun. If you liked the action in the original games but wanted more flexibility, Andromeda definitely delivers on that front. Plus, the exploration aspect is pretty cool. Driving around in the Nomad, checking out alien worlds, and slowly unraveling the mysteries of the Andromeda galaxy can be really immersive. It may not have hit the emotional highs of the earlier games, but it's not without its charm. It's also worth noting that BioWare fixed a lot of the early issues with patches, so the game today is in way better shape than it was at launch.